Well, welcome today. My book has just come out actually the last couple of weeks, so this is all very exciting for me, one of the first talks I've given on Clementine Churchill. Here's the cover of the book, and I chose this picture, you can see just what equals they were. She's no submissive, mousy wife, as you can see. She's giving him quite a long, hard stare there, I think, but they were a great partnership. And I don't know whether you've done so yet, but I strongly urge you, if you haven't, to go down towards the lake. There's a sort of Diana temple there as you sort of go down through the path. And that's where they got engaged. And if you could just put yourself for a minute into 23-year-old Clementine's shoes, she was wearing her last clean dress. She was pretty hard up as a child. So much of that in the book. I wish I had more time today to tell you about it. So there she was in her last clean dress. She'd been invited to Blenheim, rather forbidding, obviously extremely grand place. She knew why she'd been invited here, but she was waiting and waiting in an agony of suspense. This was one time when Winston actually did seem a little lost for words. So he was a global celebrity already. He was a rising politician. He was brilliant and he was rather egotistical, but he'd captured her heart and thrilled her being. And there she was in this temple. It was raining and they'd taken shelter after a very long walk. And she was waiting and waiting for him to make the move. And frankly, by this stage, her pride was rather at stake. It was also very hot. It was an August day in 1908. And so she told herself that if the spider that was crawling across the floor of the little temple at the time reached the crack in the paving stones before he asked the question or said anything important or pertinent, she was off. And Clementine was a lady who once had made up her mind, and it was that was the end of the matter. So, ladies and gentlemen, as you all know, the spider never got to the crack in the paving stones, or if it did, it was long after he popped the question, and they agreed to get married. In fact, they got married a month later. And so began one of the most important political partnerships ever, I would say to you, but actually also one of the least understood. Clementine Churchill is unbelievably little known, considering how important she was then, and actually therefore how important she is to us today. And my new book, First Lady, as you see here, really is trying to sort of remedy that. The American ambassador during the war, Gil Wynant, was a great fan of hers. She had many who were close up and saw just what she did. And he wrote just after the end of the war that one day someone of understanding would write a book that would remedy this, but would tell the world just what she contributed. And I hope my book goes some way towards that. And the fellowship from the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust was a wonderful, life-changing thing. It allowed me to go over to the States and conduct research into Clementine's work there, how she got on with Eleanor Roosevelt, which was a very important part of the war, and just generally put her in context. There are all sorts of papers at the Library of Congress and up at Hyde Park, the Roosevelt Library up there, and indeed at Boston as well, that were unbelievably helpful. And also the son of FDR's Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, is still alive, 97, absolutely cracking fellow, lots of stories to tell. So this really was a great journey, and I have to say I will always be very, very grateful to the Trust for making it possible. Just to show you Clementine as a young child, very sweet, very shy, very timid, very fearful. Her only friend for some time was that dog, Carlo, that you see there. There she was before she met Winston, a suffragist, very much in favour of the female vote, wearing the kind of shirt and tie uniform, if you held those views, not ones that were immediately shared by Winston, it has to be said. There she is, a very beautiful young woman that he fell in love with, but it wasn't just her looks, which were stunning. Photos never quite capture it. It was also the fact that she was a very clever, quite intellectual woman and loved politics just like he did, and there they are getting married. Even in the vestry rather, he spoke to Lloyd George rather than her. She knew that politics was always going to be his mistress rather than other women. And there she is looking fabulous a bit later on. I want to sort of go on further into her life though, and actually there's her head mistress who was a great sort of influence to her too. That's during the Dardanelles. I want to sort of go a bit forward into her later life though, and during the war, because I needed to compare her to Eleanor Roosevelt, obviously the First Lady in America during the Second World War, and probably a lot more famous than Clementine Churchill. I think that people know much more about Eleanor Roosevelt than they do about her. The relationship between them is a fascinating one. It's never really been explored before, incredibly, because when you think about during the Second World War, diplomacy was incredibly personal. So much rested on the personal chemistry between the people at the top here and in the US, the Roosevelts and the Churchills, obviously, particularly Winston and Franklin, but not just them. So Eleanor and Clementine, married to two men, Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt, tasked with saving the world from Hitler. What did they contribute? How involved were they? How did they get on? Did they learn from each other? Were there times when the whole Anglo-American alliance depended on them? Well, to some extent, sometimes there were times. I can tell you that neither man felt or thought very much of the other's wife, actually. And neither did either woman think very much of the other's husband, too. Churchill thought Eleanor to be an unappealing mix of forthright opinion and disapproval. And she always seemed to be away, which he couldn't really understand, even at the height of the war. And nor was she very bothered by dress or hairstyles or actually running the home. The Roosevelt White House was a bit grubby. People used to complain if they were wearing white gloves and held the banisters, you know, the rails they went up the stairs, that the gloves would be black at the end of it. Worst of all, the food was inedible. Roosevelt used to say that it would do justice to the laundromat. So Churchill couldn't understand this. Clementine, in all her kitchens, all her houses, the food was ambrosial, something she was very good at. And as you may have heard in the previous talk, she was very good at creating homes, elegant spaces, comfortable spaces in the most unpromising places, including their flat above the Cabinet War Rooms, where she turned sort of offices into really quite elegant rooms with a lot of chintz and paintings and things, but she was very good at that. Eleanor thought Churchill was a drunken warmonger with offensive views on, among other subjects, women and the Spanish Civil War, and they had the odd fight about this, although I think it's also true to say that he certainly didn't drink as much as some believe, and he was more of an advocate for peace than she ever gave him credit for. Meanwhile, Clementine thought President Roosevelt rather vain, and this may be particularly because on their first encounter he called her Clemmy. Well, you didn't do this until you'd known Clementine, for many years. Let me just get through to the... okay, right, so this is the war stuff, that's great. So he really did annoy her by calling her Clemmy, and she never forgave him for that. But she also thought that, you know, he was a little bit duplicitous, that Churchill was sometimes too emotionally open with Roosevelt, who was a colder person than Churchill. In some ways, you might argue he was a greater politician, but he was certainly a colder person, and he always privileged the national interest above friendship, whereas Churchill took friendship in a way much more seriously. And indeed, FDR would choose Stalin over Churchill later in the move when it suited America's interests. The president also thrived on unquestioning female adoration. And Eleanor Roosevelt here on the left was not a lady who was going to give it to her husband, just like she wouldn't give it to Churchill either. Several other women did, by the way. Roosevelt was not deprived of adoring female company, believe me. In fact, there were 4 women with him when he died in 1945, and not one of them was Eleanor. But anyway, so there were quite a lot of cross currents, as you might, any of you ever been out for a dinner party where you like one of the couple that you're going with, and the other one likes the other one. It's all a bit tense sometimes, and that did actually happen, times about 1,000 because of how important it was that they did get on. There were a lot of cross currents, both emotional and strategic, and it did actually fall to the women sometimes to steady the boat when the husbands were rocking it. That's not to say that it was always easy between them. They were very, very different women. I mean, I've already talked about Eleanor not really being interested in clothes or hair. She was always looking a little bit windswept, a little bit sort of dishevelled. I know that's a little bit unkind. She didn't worry about that kind of stuff. She was much more interested in people than style. Clementine, too, was incredibly shy and reserved, but again, over the time of the war, she became much better with people, much more natural, and I'll be talking about that a bit more. But just look at the difference in the way she looks there. Always the pearls, the hair immaculate, very sort of plain but elegant dresses. She had a style and she stuck to it. A lot of people tried to copy her. She was always immaculate. Strangely, she washed her hair with benzene. Highly dangerous, I would have thought, but it made her hair very sort of easy to curl and keep in place and very shiny, and that's what she did. And she did it herself. She didn't like hairdressers, but she did have her nails done at Harvey Nichols, if you like details like that. So there we are. But Eleanor was naturally more informal, more chatty, and much more independent of FDR. We've already said that she was away a lot doing her own thing, and that continued during the war. But that was partly because she was pushed out. During the 30s, during the New Deal, Eleanor had been incredibly important to FDR. That had been a great political partnership. She had toured the slums, the mines, the factories and things. She had been his ears and eyes because he had polio, as I'm sure you know. He was partly paralysed. It wasn't easy for him to tour around the place. So she became almost, you know, sort of his ambassador and one of the first great female Democrat voices as a result. Clementine had always been rather in Winston's shadow. You didn't really see her so much, or not particularly during the beginning of the war. She was a formidable force and private, by the way. She was his greatest counsellor and often the only person not afraid to take him on if she thought he'd done something wrong or was about to make some mistake or been rude to his staff. She sent him a really quite sort of forceful letter in 1940 telling him off for being rude to his staff. I can't really imagine Eleanor doing that with FDR at all, but we didn't see nearly as much of Clementine as we had got used to seeing of Eleanor. They first met in Britain at the end of 1942. Eleanor came over on her own without FDR for a tour of Britain. She wanted to see what women were doing for the war and to meet American troops. When they met, they realised that actually they had quite a lot in common, not least the fact that they were married to men trying to save the world. But they were of a similar age, aristocratic background. They shared a concern for the poor. Clementine was always a liberal, by the way, all through her life, even when Churchill re-ratted to the Tories. And she was always his social conscience, if you like. And Eleanor performed a similar role for FDR, or had done particularly during the 1930s. They both disliked gambling and extravagance. Clementine had, as I said, the picture of the little girl, she'd not been well off during her childhood at all. She was the granddaughter of an earl. Her mother was divorced, however. The father, putative father, probably wasn't her father, but he refused to pay up alimony, so they spent a lot of time moving from one set of rooms to another. So she had always sort of had this kind of sympathy for the poor and dislike of extravagance. So imagine being married to Winston Churchill if you worry about spending money. I mean, that was, you know, pretty challenging. They had both been schooled in England, by the way. Eleanor's parents died young. She was sent to boarding school in England, where her life was changed by an inspirational headmistress. Well, funny enough, Clementine went to school, unusual for her class at the time, but she went to a grammar school in Berkhamsted, where again an inspirational headmistress took her on and changed her life and made her feel that she wanted to be, you know, bookish and curious and inquiring and interested in public affairs. They both had very difficult childhoods, fearful childhoods, both of them. Clementine's sister died when she was just 16. Her sister had been her great champion. As I say, they moved around a great deal. There was no rootedness in Clementine's childhood, and very little in Eleanor's either. And they were both considered plain when young. Eleanor never really developed into beauty, though she was a fine-looking woman in her youth. She had dazzling blue eyes, slightly let down by her teeth. Clementine turned into a beauty, you know, a real kind of ugly duckling into a swan story. She, again, never really quite captured by photographs, but people who met her said that she really was quite stunning. They had both lost an infant child, and they both really rather consider themselves as inadequate mothers. And I think you can criticise both of them for their mothering, but you also need to put that in a wider context. And they both married to egotistical men who'd never quite grown up in a way, and who didn't like disciplining their broods, either of them, neither Roosevelt or Churchill. So the wives in both cases were really sort of left to discipline their broods, and that was quite difficult. And both children, you know, there were various problems with, and both women had been prone to depression. A lot of people talk about Churchill's black dog, of course, but actually it was Clementine who really had the serious depression in her life, and very serious after the war, and she had shock therapy and really quite horrible invasive treatments, which a lot of people don't know about. Eleanor too had really suffered from depression, including during the war when she felt shut out. But they were both brave and stoical, and they saw that it was their duty to help shore up that Anglo-American alliance when their husbands might fall out on, you know, strategic priorities, that kind of thing. And they would write to each other. With Clementine in particular taking on the role of a sort of ambassador extraordinaire. After one of the conferences, FDR and Churchill absolutely failed to agree on something, and so Clementine wondered what she could do about it and wrote this gushing letter to Eleanor, which she was hoping would be shown to her husband, at how much she sort of treasured their friendship, how great FDR was, how he would definitely go on and win the next election, how wonderful their daughter was. This wasn't really Clementine's style. She was doing a job of work here. She was trying to paper over some cracks, and quite often she was successful on this. Here they're making a joint broadcast together after one of the Quebec conferences, and here this is one way in which Eleanor tried to sort of shore up that alliance. She wanted to make a broadcast, but she knew how much more successful and powerful it would be if she did it with Clementine. Now, Clementine didn't want to do it. She's still quite shy at this point, and anyway, they had a luncheon where she was going to have to meet 65 guests. I think there were 7 courses, 8 different wines, 4 liqueurs. She was going to have to get through all of this before doing this broadcast with Eleanor. What did Clementine do? She hid behind a potted palm, hoping no one would notice and she'd be able to get out of it. No way. Once Eleanor Roosevelt had made up her mind, nothing much would change it. And so in the end, they did make this broadcast together. And this was not just, you know, the only occasion. They did so on many occasions after this. And actually, I think you can see that they are really quite enjoying it. There was a camaraderie there. There was something about 2 women with the same cause, defeating Hitler, coming together to broadcast together. And it was a great success. And both of them spoke French, another thing they had in common. So they were able to do the broadcast in English and in French fluently and brilliantly, because of course it was in Canada. So as I said, the first time they met was when Eleanor came to Britain on this tour. And part of the reason why she did so was because FDR was looking for a sop. She felt shut out from running the war, and indeed she was. And so he said, well, go to Britain and go on this tour. And this was one thing that she could do on her own. And it is true that the trip was an enormous success, and it gave her a feeling of being useful again, because back in the States, once the war had started, Pearl Harbor, the night of Pearl Harbor, Eleanor only knew that something extraordinary had happened and that America must have joined the war because of the frantic traffic in and out of her husband's office. He didn't think to tell her. She talked about just leaving the decisions to the important people. She wrote to her daughter, Anna, about how excluded she felt. Even Winston noticed that she was excluded. And on one of his trips to the White House, he was having drinks with FDR one evening and mentioned the fact that Eleanor seemed so excluded. And he said, I tell Clemmy everything. And FDR said, yes, I know, but I can't tell Eleanor everything. And he used the excuse that she had a newspaper column and that she might forget what was secret and put something secret in the column. I think that was just something to say. I actually think that at this point that political partnership was dying, just as the Churchill political partnership, man and wife, were really, really strong and a team together. And indeed, Clementine knew about all the important decisions of the war. She knew about the ultra decrets from Bletchley Park when a lot of the cabinet didn't. And so she was very much part of things and kept an eye on the home front for him, trying to see political problems before they arose, trying to head them off. She talked to members of the cabinet. She got them involved in all her various projects. She was very much involved. However, when Eleanor came to Britain, she was treated like an A-list celebrity. She received standing ovations in Oxford, Cambridge, Bristol, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow, Belfast and Edinburgh. And in London, I mean, just like, I suppose, George Clooney turned up or something, people loitered around the American embassy just to get a glimpse of her. She wasn't a silent shadow to her husband. She may have lost her power at home, but she was no silent shadow, and people loved that. And they saw that she used her fame and her popularity to aid others or support worthy causes or to raise morale. And she had this wonderful, chatty, informal style, seen as very American at the time. But this had a really big impact on Clementine, who'd been this sort of rather shy person before. So she was watching and learning. And after all, Eleanor too had a pretty aristocratic background. This didn't stop her being really chatty with all sorts of people. And Clementine noticed that Eleanor called her secretary by her first name. That was unthinkable. But Eleanor thought, what a good idea. And so she started doing the same. Clementine was dazzled by Eleanor's success with people and crowds. And she wrote to Roosevelt, another example, by the way, of her being this sort of diplomat, about how his wife's presence was having, the effect that his wife's presence was having on our women and our girls. When she appears, their faces light up with gladness and welcome. She also paid tribute to Eleanor's handling of the press. I was struck by the ease, friendliness and dignity with which she talked with the reporters, and by the esteem and affection with which they evidently regard her. So Clementine was obviously, doing the sort of the friendly thing to President Roosevelt. There was a good strategic purpose for doing that, but she was watching and learning. Eleanor, meanwhile, found Clementine very attractive, youthful and charming, but constrained, she thought until now, by Winston's notion that women should remain in the background, and therefore very difficult to get to know initially. Eleanor wrote in her diary, Clementine has had to assume a role because of being in public life. The role is now part of her, but one wonders what she is like underneath. Gradually they got to know each other, and they certainly relished each other's company, and a bond grew. Clementine always arranged these tours very, very carefully, and she would take Eleanor to bomb sites, and she would take her to cities that were under attack. And one day they visited Canterbury, where as soon as they arrived, great surges of women and children rushed up to meet them both, again like film stars. The appalling thing was that the next day the Germans bombed Canterbury by daylight, and Eleanor was deeply troubled because it was more than likely that some of those women, some of those children that she'd met in such glorious, wonderful, friendly way had been killed. And she wrote to FDR that the spirit of the English people is something to bow down to. But from then on, there was this bond between the women, and Clementine did lower her guard a little. There was a certain female solidarity. And one evening that came out quite spectacularly, actually. There was a dinner party for Eleanor at Downing Street with Winston, obviously Clementine, a couple of others, and the subject turned to the Spanish Civil War, and Eleanor asked Churchill why more had not been done to help the Republicans, and kept pressing her point, and he got rather cross. In fact, he was furious. People didn't, challenge him in this way, certainly not a woman challenging him in this way, and he stood up. It was quite clear that dinner was over, and he was furious. But Clementine leant across the table and said pointedly, I think perhaps Mrs. Roosevelt is right. Now, this may be that she was welcoming a little bit of female solidarity, Or it may be that she was again doing her ambassador extraordinaire thing and making sure that no one was upset. After all, American support was vital. We absolutely had to be singing from the same song sheet. But it's just quite an interesting glimpse into that relationship, and that she was no pushover, Americans, Clementine, far from it. I've talked again about that letter between them as well, but by the time Eleanor returned to Washington, she was full of the courage and devotion of British women to the war effort. And she was, often urged on by Clementine, these women, and she went back to the States with all sorts of ideas as to what she could introduce there in terms of raising morale, and if they were ever subject to bombing raids themselves, what they could do. But there was one other way in which Clementine influenced the great First Lady on this occasion. I don't think it has ever happened before, but when she got back, Eleanor asked for an hour and a half to be set aside in her diary. And during that hour and a half, she went and had her hair and nails done. And this is probably the first and only time that anyone could remember her setting aside specific time for that. It's interesting, though, after this visit, there they are again meeting in Quebec. There is Clementine looking, that's during the war, and she really did make sure she looked good at all times. By the way, the turban is her tribute to female munitions workers, and other female workers in the factories had to wear turbans for safety reasons. And so Clementine, as part of her, brilliant spin doctoring this, by the way, as part of her tribute and sort of gesture of solidarity, almost always wore a turban, often in silks and beautiful fabrics and things. But this was her way of saying, I am with you. And again, it was very effective, and not something that maybe SAMCAM has quite cottoned onto yet and maybe would like to think about. Maybe not turbans, but something else. Okay, I just want to try and find this other picture. Sorry, they're not quite in the order I was expecting. Anyway, I'll go back to it later. So after the trip with Eleanor, Clementine started to push herself forwards more and more. She made more broadcasts. She went on to give her own press conferences, actually, in Washington and in Moscow. Right, okay, I think one more. Unprecedented. Again, can you imagine SAMCAM giving her own press conference in Washington to the American press, or indeed in Moscow to the press over there, international press? She did push herself forward. She did become more chatty. Here she's visiting a factory and dancing with a factory worker. This was wonderful. It went down brilliantly well. Notice again the turban, that coat often comes out actually. This was one of her sort of coats of defiance as she saw it. And again, I think hopefully the picture, yes. See again, she's there, she's with Winston, again very chatty. She was pushing herself forward. She saw how important that was. And she had learnt quite a lot of that from Eleanor Roosevelt. She used this to great effect. She raised the equivalent of £300 million from a bankrupt country, and we were at that point, for her Aid to Russia fund. This was a fund that helps us with our own sort of alliance with Soviet Russia, pretty tricky many times, as you can imagine. The fund went to re-equip Russian hospitals that had been bombed by the Nazis. Eventually, she was invited to Moscow by herself, by Stalin, to receive a medal. That's a whole other story and a terrific one. But this was all because she really started to understand, I hate that word, but ordinary people, people outside the Churchill's magic circle, if you like. It was something that she'd very much learnt from Eleanor. And in fact, when the US Treasury Secretary came over in 1944, Henry Morgenthau, he wanted a tour around the air raid shelters. And this was a time when Churchill himself was not very popular. People were sort of absolutely fed up with the war. Just suffering continued, day and night. They were getting frustrated. And someone had to take Henry Morgenthau round the air raid shelters. No member of the government could be thought of who could do so without inciting some kind of protest. And then suddenly someone came up with the obvious answer. Of course, they said, Mrs. Churchill must take him around the air raid shelters, because everyone knew there would be no protest, there would be no disgruntlement on show. It would all go smoothly. And indeed it did. And she talked to the people in the raid shelters, and she talked about practical solutions for their problems. And Henry Morgenthau watched. His wife, Eleanor, was Eleanor Roosevelt's best friend. And he realized, as he watched Clementine Churchill, my goodness, there's something familiar. The dame is unbelievable. I know what it is. She's just like Eleanor Roosevelt. So there we are, two women who learnt a lot from each other, who did an awful lot to shore up the Anglo-American alliance. And there she is at the White House. There they are again. There she is in Russia. That's her Aid to Russia fund. That's one of her flyers. That's in 1945. She had a fantastic laugh, by the way, as you can probably see there. That's later on in their lives. Always elegant, as you can see. There they are, the two old ladies gossiping after the war. And that's my book. So once again, I think we have a great debt of gratitude to both women. They deserve, and particularly Clementine, deserves her moment in the sun. Thanks very much indeed for listening.